Thank you, Paloma. So just for us to know that we are going to be using this recording, but this is going to be a safe space and conversation, but for y'all to be able to revisit afterwards if you would like to. And I am really excited to get us kicked off again. Best practices for me, if you would love to show your face on video, that would be fantastic. Although I love seeing Zara's face, I see it every day. So I would love to get to meet and know some of all of you as well, if you can. If not, that's also completely okay. And also thank you, Farheen. Lovely to meet you as well. So we are hosting our Corporate Circles, our inclusive conversation series. And today what we're really going to be focusing on is the workplace of the future. So how can companies plan for the ever-changing? So a little bit about this is that something that it's very near and dear to our hearts here at PowerToFly of really thinking about what does the diverse and equitable workplace of the future look like? And we're really looking forward to sharing our learnings with you, hearing your thoughts, and really leading us through a conversation today. Sorry, there's a motorcycle in the background. Leading us through a conversation today where we're really going to be able to engage, hear from one another, and hopefully take something out of it. But before we do that, I just want to give a quick introduction of myself and Zara, who will be my co-facilitators today. So, hello, my name is Sienna Brown. I am the Global Director of DEI. And where I really focus on is really being able to craft a strong DEI vision for the company and leading our team of change makers towards achieving it. So really thinking about how are we having long-term impact and innovation with inclusive companies to help underrepresented talent thrive. Like I'd mentioned before, I am based in Spain, so I really like to look at the global perspective. How are we thinking about this from a sense of cross-cultural communication and understanding as well? And really being able to say, how are we sparking change through awareness, action, and accountability? And Zara, I will pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sienna. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here on a Friday with you all. So I get to work with Sienna every day. I am on the DEI team here at PowerToFly. I'm a global DEI strategist and trainer. I am a passionate disruptor, and I really prioritize the creation and facilitation of brave spaces where people are able to bring their whole selves and places where individuals can also talk a little bit more and discuss their intersectional identities. I come with an extensive background in HR, operations, and programming, and I've worked in a number of different type of sectors. So I try to really bring all of that knowledge every day to all of the different clients and companies that I get to interact with. I also try to make sure I infuse humor in everything that we do. And I will openly share my love for donuts and Brooklyn, which is where I am based. And a friendly reminder, folks can please mute yourselves as you enter this space. We would really appreciate it. And I will kick it back over to Sienna.
Fantastic, thanks, Ian. Also a welcome to those of you who are coming in. Again, if you would love to, we would love to see your faces so that we can have this be more of a conversation. While yes, we will be leading and facilitating this conversation, we're also going to be looking to you to hear some of the things that y'all are rolling out in your company so that we can also learn from one another. So as most of us know, regarding helpful hints, so if you have any logistical questions, definitely just pop them in the chat and we will be able to support. And at least we're consistent. We would love to see your faces on camera if possible. And then also we really want you to actively participate in the conversation, right? So really thinking about it and being able to say, how are we engaging with one another, learning from one another, sharing thoughts either in the chat or when the time is right, coming off mute. We will also have some discussion moments in our conversation today, and we'll really be talking through the following. And also just to name that the session is being recorded, but it's for internal purposes only, so no worries about that. So when we think about what we're going to talk about today, y'all, I will also name it 6 p.m. here for me on a Friday. So if I start stumbling over my words, it's because I'm on my second cup of coffee. But today we're going to be engaging in conversation around 3 main things, right? We're going to be talking about what employees are asking for within the workplace, right? Navigating a hybrid workforce, and then also how can we create an elevated sense of belonging and understanding with our teams. So with that, Z, I'm going to pass it over to you and paint the picture around the Great Resignation.
Yes, thanks so much, Sienna. So this is something that we've been hearing a lot about. It's a very trendy topic these days, but it's directly affecting a lot of companies. So let's talk about it a little bit further. So what is the Great Resignation? So this is a phrase that's used to describe the prediction that people who remained in their jobs during the uncertainty of the pandemic may be quitting their jobs as workplaces return to normal. I also want to name that it's not even just a prediction anymore. We're seeing it happen in real time, but this phrase was of course coined before when people were sort of anticipating this loss within the workplaces. So just want to name that within the US in April of 2021, nearly 4 million employees quit their job. And then in May of 2021, 3.6 million employees were quitting their jobs, right? And so now come the end of July, there was a record high 10.9 million open job openings across the US. So again, it's not just a prediction anymore, right? We're seeing it in reality. And a lot of the different companies that we speak to and we talk to about this are really struggling with hiring and filling these roles, and also like high turnover and retention is definitely something that companies are really thinking more about and focusing on. So let's also discuss some more concrete like data numbers for you all, right? So 41% of the global workforce are considering leaving their current employer. And again, this is global workforce, right? This isn't even just in the US. And so this is a survey that was done by monster.com, right? So again, this is not an insignificant number, right? And then 30% of employees said that they'd be likely to switch jobs if they were required to be fully on site, which again, as workplaces are sort of returning to normal and asking folks to come in person, that's also adding to the numbers of folks that are resigning from certain companies and looking for other jobs. And of course, we can't talk about the employment flux that's happening without discussing the recent vaccine mandate, right? And it's also its possible implications for the workforce. So President Biden recently announced that all companies with 100+ employees will need to be fully vaccinated or perform weekly tests. So we are seeing pushback from certain individuals, right, who don't want to sort of feel the need to be vaccinated. And so we're seeing that actually reflected in the losses that we're talking about in the numbers of folks that are leaving. And so these numbers will also be adding to the Great Resignation, right? So again, it's only going to sort of complicate the discussion a little bit further, but we definitely need to be mindful of that as we embark on this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Sienna. And I think also just leaning into that, that being said, I also think that this really gives us an amazing chance and an amazing opportunity, right? So when we think about it, this is actually from Bill Scheninger, I hope I pronounced his last name right, from McKinsey & Company. And he said, this is an unbelievable opportunity to remake culture, right? It's rare in a leader's lifetime to have such a clean drop for reshaping how you run the place, right? And I really want us to think about this in our discussion today and then just in general, but really being able to say, how are we using the current situation? How are we really being able to talk through and ask ourselves, okay, what will we decide, right? And us as leaders at companies are really in an amazing place to be able to say, how are we leaning in to hear what is it that our current and our future employees really want? And then how are we going to show up to really be able to have an impact across the board? So let's shift gears a little bit. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking through what are employees actually asking for within the workplace, right? And when we think about this, there are a couple of things that a lot of employees are looking for, right? So many employees, and especially those from marginalized groups, are looking for companies that truly have their best interests in mind. And so thinking about that as parents, BIPOC individuals, individuals who are neurodiverse, those who are going through health hurdles, both physical and mental disabilities, et cetera, right? And so when we hear what are employees actually looking for, they're looking for flexibility in their schedule with remote work opportunities, right? So thinking about this as not just being able to say, of course, we all have hours where our offices are most likely working, but saying, if I have to start at 6 a.m. with children, how will that impact my work? How will that impact my ability to show up? And so thinking about how can we be flexibility with our schedules, and then also thinking about mental health, they're looking for focus and support, right? So they're really looking to be able to say, how am I also, how am I also having a chance to be able to have resources to be able to support my mental health, and also work in a company where work-life balance is something that's also really focused on, right? And we've seen this a lot during the pandemic of people feeling overworked, of people not really having boundaries or limits. And so when we think about this, really being able to ask ourselves, this is what employees are asking for, and what can we do about it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. In addition, we're seeing that employees want for company-wide commitment to DEI, right? And I think that this is something that's really interesting because we've seen, especially over the past couple of years, that it's really focusing on how are we not just talking about it, but what are we actually doing, right? So yes, making a commitment, but then also having that be tied into action. And the last thing is that employees are no longer seeking, right? They're no longer seeking simply a boss or a manager, but they're also seeking a coach, right? And so when we think about this, obviously this differentiates based on different ages, based on different cultures, based on different locations, et cetera. But these are the things that we're finding across the board. So when we lean into this, and I also want y'all to be reflecting a little bit about what is it that your employees, both current and future, are asking for, right? And so when we think about each generation, they really have different things that they're seeking for in their employer. And this is important for us to take into account. So for example, when we look at this, we have young millennials and Gen Z, so individuals who were born from 1989 to 2001. Their main three focuses are, number one, that the organization cares about my well-being. Number two, that the organization's leadership is ethical. And number three, that the organization is diverse and inclusive of all people. And this is from a Gallup report. And so we're able to see, okay, well, this is what is most important for individuals, and also realizing that going back to the stats that, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, y'all. Going back to the stats that Zara was sharing before, really being able to say, although there are a lot of job opportunities open, people are being very strategic with where they want to be joining and who they're looking to join with. So really thinking about these things and saying, well, how can we be showing up for these different generations that we're trying to attract, right? Older millennials, so from 1980 to 1988, they also want to focus on the organization caring about the employees' well-being, the organization's leadership being ethical, but this is also where you see a little bit of a shift. So the organization's leadership is open and transparent, right? So again, we're seeing for older millennials, okay, well, is diversity and inclusion the most important thing in their top three? Not necessarily, but we're seeing that with younger millennials and Gen Z, that is. Gen X as well, we can see organization's leadership is ethical is number one. They care about their well-being and the organization's financial stability. And then when we look at baby boomers, what we're able to see is, again, for them, the organization's leadership is ethical, they care about our well-being, and that also focusing on financial stability. So when we think about these different things, I definitely want us to think through some of the top talent that we've found and some of the top talent that we have right now and what's most important to them in the workplace. So this is a chance for, again, us to now interact. And what we're going to do is let's discuss. So I would love for us to talk through, and you can just come off of mute, come on camera if you'd like to share, but for us to really be able to share any best practices and ways that we have seen our companies proactively demonstrating its commitment to what employees are seeking. And I will stop sharing my screen here, and this can just be a free for all. So you can feel free to come off camera or come off of mute and share. Absolutely.
I'll mention something. My company just recently actually did a population or demographic survey to try and evaluate like how our actual policies are being implemented and whether or not we actually have the metrics or the numbers to actually see that they're making an influence. And it really gave us key insights to, okay, where do we need to work harder and like trying to bring others in, and how are we actually like validating whether or not our policies are actually having an impact. And it was actually pretty insightful.
Thank you so much for sharing, Erin. And I think I love that. The one thing that I really want to highlight about what you said is being able to say, making sure that our initiatives are actually having impact, right? And this is something that we've seen time and time again. There's so many studies that are out now saying companies have all of these different initiatives, but they're not actually having an impact on the marginalized group. So I love the fact that y'all are surveying and then also being able to now listen, adapt, and then take action with what's having the most impact.
Yeah, the problem that we've seen like historically is that we'd see good initiatives, or at least like initiatives that seem to be like aimed at doing good, but then when you actually look at them, they don't have an actual impact. So there's a number of things that we'd seen in HR where I don't know, companies would undertake some sort of task to try and facilitate like ensuring that they could meet diversity, and they were usually like very superficial, like, oh, we'll just put pride stickers, up one, on 1 month, or those kinds of things. So you actually see like systemic changes by employing ERGs or things of this nature that could actually like give us metrics associated with facilitating that change. So that survey alone, just that act alone, gave us some picture about whether or not they're actually being impactful.
Thank you for sharing, Erin. I love it. And I see also Lauren and Tracy, y'all have both come on camera. Would you all like to share something?
I can. So I'm from Canada, so a little bit different, I think, than most of the people here. One thing that I thought interesting, the thread of ethical, that was important. We just finished at our company, and we do it every year, what we call a guiding principles session. Every employee, whether they're contract or full-time, participates. And what we do is we run through a few scenarios where things are tested around ethics, performance, integrity, and partnership. Diversity and inclusion is a big part of that as well. And it's really not like there's an answer, there's a discussion. And it's incredibly powerful to have that happen. And it's just part of what we do every year. So I just thought that was interesting as a different practice, maybe to address that piece.
I was just going to say, I love that, Tracy, because it's also, you get that collaborative buy-in of everyone being able to share, and also having their voice, right, actually lent to building out something to help guide like where the organization is going. I think that's so key, and that's so important. So thank you for sharing that.
I thought, this is Rob from PowerToFly. I thought one of the interesting things that we had a discussion like this one with LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and they had put out a really great press release announcing what they're going to be doing moving forward, which is that they basically are allowing people, if they want to work in person, if they want to work from home, if they want to do a hybrid. And what they basically said was they trust their employees, and it's all kind of framed around trust. And I thought that was a really kind of interesting approach, because especially as you know, there's constant change happening, and we don't always know, you know, we're talking about surveying and reaching out to people, but you know, we don't always know what's going on in everyone's lives. So just giving that trust to your employees to make that decision that works, you know, best for them, while also obviously making a safe environment for everyone else, whether it's vaccines or something else along those lines, I thought was a really interesting way to approach an office.
I can share. I work in architecture and design. It's a new field for me, and it's interesting because we know and acknowledge that we're predominantly white male field, and helping I have no decision-making power as to the policies around this, but helping our leadership to understand that there's a connection between recruiting and retaining diverse talent and offering that flexibility. Our offices are in downtown LA. It's very expensive to live there. And so when you offer hybrid or remote work, you're actually being more inclusive of the types of people we're trying to recruit. And so I think we're really close to making that connection points for leadership, but it's a new way of thinking. And I think we're highlighting issues that were within our field for a long time, but now we're really talking about it because of the pandemic. So it's exciting.
I was just going to say, Laura, this is definitely something that I've spoken to a few companies about, in terms of when you only offer like in-person work, you're only recruiting from a specific geographic area, you know, so like now you're actually opening it up and allowing for opportunities to really diversify your staff. So I love that. And I love that you're able to like bring that to leadership. I also just wanted to name, I saw Tracy raise their hand a little while ago. Did you have something to share again, Tracy?
Oh, I just wanted to ask, with that statement that LinkedIn went to, one of the things we're struggling a little bit as we try and figure out the back to work options is the mentoring of junior people. and how you do that when certain people will say, you know what, I'm quite comfortable at home, I like my routine, and actually sometimes more senior people, because they've built relationships already, they have their own sort of confidence in their expertise, and then the juniors are left kind of spinning on their own without the ability to apprentice in the moment. And so I just was curious how companies are thinking about that.
Yeah, and we actually, very timely, because we actually hosted an executive forum just last week here at PowerToFly on early career development. And one of the things I think we talked about is actually how can those two different groups that you just mentioned, Tracy, learn from each other? So is there a way that you can partner, whether it's a formal mentorship program or something else, partner a more experienced person with that younger person, not just so that younger person can learn from the experienced person, but also vice versa, because as we're now in this virtual world, maybe an older person is going to be able to learn more about that. The younger person who might never have worked in an office is going to be learning that from the more experienced hire. So I definitely think and we actually surveyed the attendees at that event, and a lot of people are starting to do that, and they hadn't previously had those kind of programs and are now really pursuing that. So that's definitely something that we're seeing a lot of companies, both Fortune 500 companies and smaller startups, pursuing.
I love it. Well, thank you all for engaging so far. For this part, we're just getting started with the conversation. So we're going to move forward, and we're just going to talk about some key takeaways for each of the different sections, right? So we were just sharing, let me share my screen again. We were just sharing what have we been doing and thinking of regarding what our companies are proactively doing, right? And so a couple of things that we can be thinking about here, right? Number one is providing flexible work options regarding work schedules, location, really leaning into various employee situations. And also something that we saw is that, excuse me, with one of the clients that we work with, it was really amazing because we were able to see them actually send out a survey, kind of like what Erin had shared before on employee engagement, and really be able to see that by doing this, previously quiet employees were becoming more active and vocal in naming their wants and needs. And it served as a way to kind of like spark new company-wide conversations and having leadership foster these conversations as well. So as we're thinking about these takeaways, just really thinking about how can we also be tuning into what we can be doing. And so another one is consider providing mental health resources for our teams and creating company policies that support work-life balance, right? So another company of ours that we work with, something that they do is they have Mindspace Wednesdays. So on Wednesdays, they don't take any meetings, and it's something that's not just on certain teams, but rolled out company-wide. So really showing that commitment, right? They also just recently took off a quiet week, where they're able to say, okay, we're going through a lot. How are we making sure that we're not having any meetings, that you all can take time that you need, and really prioritizing that. Something else that we can do, and this is kind of what I had shared before, but again, creating these forums and spaces for employees to share their wants and needs, and really having, again, leadership proactively address these. So like we were saying before, not just sharing surveys, not just creating surveys and sharing them, but also taking action from them and getting leadership buy-in. I love this. Tracy saying that they have recharge Fridays and COVID support days and unplugged days. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. So with this, I'm now going to pass it over to Z to talk about navigating a hybrid workforce.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Sienna. So yes, let's talk a little bit more about the challenges that might arise with navigating a hybrid workforce and how we can really sort of work with that. So I wanted to walk us through some examples of how certain companies have responded, right? Because we've already kind of spoken about how employees, we're seeing that they're seeking more flexibility and remote work opportunities. So as we're really thinking about the workforce potentially shifting to become more hybrid, like let's look at how Apple responded, for instance, right? So on the left-hand side, you'll see the company action, and on the right-hand side, we'll quickly go through like what the impact is on the employees, right? So in June, Apple CEO Tim Cook sent out a company-wide memo stating that workers needed to return to the office 3 days a week. Right. So basically, employee voice wasn't taken into account, right? With this decision, it was coming from the top down, and employees will be losing flexibility with this request, right? So employees actually responded with their own letter where they asked for more flexible work from home policy, right? So again, they felt empowered to share their voice and state their needs and their wants. So Apple's response was that they doubled down on their requirement, stating that workers will still need to return to the office 3 days a week, right? So again, employees felt empowered to share their voice, did so, and then their voice was not taken into account, was not heard, was not valued. And this decision by Apple will most likely lead to some employees leaving, right? We already kind of earlier were discussing the Great Resignation and how people are really looking for jobs in industries with that will provide them with that support that they're really looking for, with that flexibility that they're looking for. So this is one way that a company responded. Let's look at a different response. So now we're going to talk about Microsoft, right? So Microsoft, a actual quote from the Microsoft executive VP is that our goal is to give employees further flexibility, allowing people to work where they feel most productive and comfortable, while also encouraging employees to work from home as the virus and related variants remain concerning. And so you see that mindset, how that's reflected in how Microsoft is actually responding. So Microsoft surveyed thousands of employees who returned to work sites in some capacity, and they created this COVID-19 hybrid dial that you see on the screen right now. So you'll see that flexibility between the office and the home remains an urgent concern. So 54% of survey respondents who chose to return in stage 4 are spending less than 25% of their time in an office, and 69% are spending 50% or less time on site. So you can actually see, again, where people are and how much time they're spending in the office, and that it's flexible, right? And so I think the key word here is flexibility, right? And so you saw from the Microsoft VP that sort of mindset about wanting to provide employees with that level of flexibility, which we've seen across the board in numerous studies. That's what employees are really looking for. And so that's how Microsoft responded. Obviously, two very different responses to what employees are sort of asking for and what the current needs are. So I'm going to shift us a little bit. So now that we sort of saw how other companies responded, I would love for us to discuss amongst ourselves, we're going to put you all in breakout groups actually, to discuss a little bit about in what ways have you allowed employees to share their thoughts and feedback around returning to the office or navigating hybrid work. So what are the opportunities and the spaces that we may be creating for our folks to really voice what their needs and wants are? So with that, I'm going to ask our lovely host to please put us into breakout groups, I would say of 3 to 4 folks, and we'll be in breakouts for 12 minutes. So on my end over here right now, it's 29. So we will be asking folks to come back at 41. So please, again, we will drop the question and broadcast it all out to you as well. But in what ways have you allowed employees to share their thoughts and feedback around returning to the office or navigating hybrid work? We'll see you back here.
Okie dokie. So welcome back, everyone. We're just going to give it another moment for people to travel through cyberspace back in here into the main room. Awesome. I think that's just about everyone. So Sienna and Zara, back to you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Rob. And I love seeing people's faces. Yay, people. So welcome back. You made it through the virtual vortex. Sienna, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen just for a second. So I just wanted to sort of share this quote before we open it up to hear what some folks shared about. So I think it's really important to know that with folks trying to focus on like bringing people back to offices and kind of like trying to get back to the way things were, I think this quote is really key for us to keep in mind. So it was said by Brian Hancock at McKinsey & Company, but some leaders are thinking about what a new culture and a new way of working might look like and how to perpetuate culture in a primarily hybrid world. Others are saying that they need everybody back in the office to preserve their culture, but you can't assume you'll return to the same culture that existed pre-pandemic. There's been too much change, both at the individual level and at the business level. So I just wanted to sort of frame that even as we sort of consider bringing people back to office or like bringing people in person, that culture that existed pre-pandemic no longer exists, right? So we have to really keep in mind those shifts as well as we have these discussions. So Sienna, you can stop sharing your screen. Thank you so much for that. And I'd love to open it up to the groups. What did you all talk about? If we could hear from maybe one or two folks in terms of what you shared in your breakout group, that would be wonderful. I know you all had wonderful conversations. I'm very excited to hear some insights.
It was interesting because at first it took a while for us to get started. And then I think when we were getting there and then we came back. So I think that's why some of the silence, we were just sharing a little bit about the return to work, and like a lot of us sent out surveys, collecting the data, having the data in order to be able to make a decision. I think some of us are having soft launches, in a sense that some people will go on a hybrid mode. So that was kind of where we were headed to.
Yeah, no, and I totally hear that, right? Like it's kind of like you start getting into a discussion and then we got to bring you back. But I also think it's helpful for us to just, talk even about this in the larger space as well. So I appreciate that, Gracie, and for you sharing what you all were beginning to talk about. So I know that Gemma had raised their hand. So Gemma, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, in our group, I heard from some, let's see, Tracy's in Toronto, and I think Melanie, is in near Sacramento, California. I'm near San Francisco, and we all shared like they shared what their companies have done in the past year. I'm not working. I'm with this one full time. I quit my job by choice 3 months ago, just because it was just too much to handle at home with her. But I know what my former company did, and it was this. I worked in HR. It was a CPA firm headquartered in New York, and technically our doors never really shut down across the country. There was just like very few people that had to be in the office or like really, really wanted to be. So they weren't working from home with children, were in the office. But like June 2020, no, October 2020, I was on maternity leave. They kind of were like, okay, like let's get everyone back. And I heard, because I wasn't working, I was on leave, that didn't sit well with a lot of people, which understandably so. But I think as I tried to figure out what I want to do next in terms of professional work, like everything that you were saying, Sienna and Zara, in this presentation, like I'm an older millennial, just based on the years I just made it to that. And I really, really care about what does the chief level, the C-suite look like? Is it all white men? Is it half women? Is it some people of color? Like I'm a brown woman who's a...
Oh, you became muted, Gemma, as you were speaking.
There's so much more that I care about because I became a mom in the pandemic last year. She was 14 months and 2 days on Sunday. But like, it's not just the responsibility I feel for like who's working now. It's also as a mother, like I care about making it better for her when she does work full time.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, Gemma. And I think also like, I appreciate you bringing in even your personal experience, right? And like your personal identity. Like, I think finally companies are sort of like recognizing that we are all complex individuals that have intersectional identities. We can't leave things at the door, right? So you made a career choice that reflects your priorities. And so how can companies continue to prioritize their folks and their needs in these ways where people do feel like they can show up completely, So I appreciate you sharing that, Gemma.
And I think too, I think another thing, that made me think of is it's even beyond the C-suite now and into, the boardroom as well. that we're seeing a lot more, the people demanding that diversity in the, the boardroom, not just in the C-suite. We have a discussion about that coming up in next month's summit, which is on lifting Latinx voices, talking about getting more Latinx and Hispanic voices in the boardroom as well. So, it's definitely going from everyone from the individual contributor up to the tippy top of a company.
Yeah, that makes sense. Amazing. Cool. So we're going to move us along. So if Sienna, you wouldn't mind sharing your screen. Amazing. Thank you. So just some key takeaways for us. So number one, really surveying your employees, right? To better understand potential thoughts, hesitations, and feedback that they may have for returning to the office. Again, we want to ensure that people are able, kind of like what Microsoft did, right? They surveyed their folks to get an idea of what people really wanted, and then they were able to build out a plan based on that. And so again, that's kind of like what we're advising everyone to be doing, to be able to survey their folks and really build out that plan. Second, we're going to have to re-envision, right, what workplace culture and office environment looks like in order to meet those employee needs. And that was the quote that we shared a little bit earlier, right? Again, that workplace culture that existed pre-pandemic, pre-working remote, that culture is gone, right? We need to really be able to lean into and be comfortable with the fact that we do have to re-envision what that culture and what the office environment in general looks like moving forward. And then finally, we want to work with leadership to identify and commit to an action plan, right? Because again, it's wonderful to hear from folks, but if leadership isn't acting on it, then that's another challenge area, right? We want to make sure that we're not only hearing from folks, but we're actually acting on it. So this will ultimately improve employee retention. And this will also help us identify opportunities to hire more geographically and globally diverse staff, especially as we have a hybrid workforce, right? We were mentioning this earlier. When you're looking for only in person, you're very limited to whoever can live in that area, which means in specific areas where the cost of living is very high, you're going to be attracting certain demographics, certain identities that can afford that, right? Certain class backgrounds. And so in order to be more inclusive and get a more diverse staff, offering hybrid option or folks to work remotely is really going to get us there. But again, leadership needs to be able to commit to creating an action plan around that. So with that, I am going to kick it back over to Sienna.
Thanks, Zee. Thank you so much for this. And also thank y'all for those of you who are engaging in the chat. This is fantastic. So we've covered a little bit so far. Now I really want us to lean into, okay, well, how can we find ways to elevate a sense of belonging and understanding, right? Because I think something that we're thinking about is okay, how are we taking action? But then also something that I say quite often is, how do we think about the most underrepresented person in the room, right? And being able to say, okay, well, there might be a sense of belonging or understanding for the majority group, but how are we thinking about the most underrepresented person? And so I want to do a quick activity that I love to do, but if someone could, or I know that y'all aren't on video, but in the chat, how many of us here are left-handed? If you're left-handed, just feel free to drop it in the chat. It's a lot more impactful with video, I'll just let y'all know, but it's okay. So for those of us who aren't, how many of us are right-handed? So if anyone is left-handed, if you can just come off of mute and say, I'm a lefty, that would be fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to make the assumption that we are all right-handed individuals in this room, right? Now I want to ask us a follow-up question. For those of us who are right-handed, how many of us think about what it's like being left-handed on a daily basis or at all? Perfect. Tracy, tell me why.
My mom is left-handed, and
Yeah.
when she was a kid, she was strapped for using her left hand. So it was
Yeah.
actual physical punishment. And so although she's reverted to using her left hand when she left school, she writes very poorly because she didn't have the practice. So she doesn't write well in either hand anyway. And scissors, the whole world doesn't work for right-handed people or left-handed people.
I love that. So Tracy, I want to number one say, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think something that's so interesting is, again, you think about this because someone that you know and you care about has had this experience, right? You've also been able to hear their lived experiences, what they've gone through, and see also the larger impact that that's had on her writing, on her, from a psychological point of view, et cetera. And then also the other impact of not being able to use scissors or having to go and buy other scissors, whatever that is. And so I think about it, and I want us to think about this. Left-handed and right-handed is an easy example, but how many other identities and how many other marginalized groups are there out there? And how can we always think about, excuse me, again, how are we uplifting the most underrepresented person in the room? And so also saying that we have the power and privilege that we have to even be here in this room right now is being able to say, how can we start thinking about, well, what are the lived experiences that I might not necessarily think about on a daily basis? Or if there are lived experiences that I hear because of someone that I know or that I care about, how can I show up and be an ally, right? So when thinking about this, whether we're thinking about left-handed, also personality differences, and then of course, wider parts of the intersectionality of our identities, it's really important for us to think about how can we elevate the sense of belonging and understanding, right? So if we want to look at some of the data is always fantastic. There has been a Glint study conducted with almost 1 million data points finding that excuse me, employees with a strong sense of belonging were 6 times more engaged, right? There was a 56% increase in job performance. There was a 50% drop in turnover risk, and there was a 75% reduction in sick days. And I want to let this like sit for a second, because when we think about belonging, it's like, okay, well, the company culture is cool. I feel like I belong, right? But I think it's really important to be able to say, okay, but what about that individual who maybe might have been at the company for a short amount of time, or might be a little bit more introverted instead of extroverted in team meetings, or someone who might be a parent who is back in the workforce and they might be dealing with needing more flexibility in their day schedules, whatever that looks like, right? Really being able to say that like belonging is something that often gets left out when we talk about DEI, right? It's like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but how are we also thinking about DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? And this really goes back to what we were talking about before of like, this is just people being able to show up as their real selves and being able to feel like they belong. And I think that this is important because again, the physical and mental task that it takes to have someone show up each day and try to be someone that they're not because of that's taking time and energy away from them actually doing their work, right? Of them actually being able to step into their zone of genius, of them actually being able to be more productive. So we see this 56% increase in job performance because of course, people are focused on doing great work versus on thinking about the fact that they don't necessarily feel like they fit in or belong in their company. And so again, this goes back to what we were seeing with, excuse me, what Zara had shared around the Great Resignation of really being able to see individuals are leaving companies and we're seeing it across the board. And so thinking about how can we really foster this sense? So yes, of course. Thank you, Farheen. So some of these numbers, one of them comes from Glint studies, and some of them also come from a Better Up study that was conducted a couple of years ago. So maybe we can send some of these studies out in the follow-up resources. And I was like, I'll have Rob name if that's possible or not, but perfect. Okay, great. So as we move forward, I want us to think a little bit about what can companies do, right? The first one is really thinking about, now that we know how much a sense of belonging matters, what are we actually able to do about it? So gain perspective, right? And I think that this first one is really being able to say, how are we having open and transparent conversations that can really help decrease problems that are associated with the lack of belonging, right? We'll use the left-handed, right-handed example as well, because we were talking about it. If I don't have someone who is left-handed in my family, or I might not have heard what Tracy had shared, I might not have never thought, okay, well, this is something that someone who's left-handed goes through, right? Someone might say, okay, well, maybe you just need a different desk, instead of saying all the different things and nuances that come with something that's so ingrained into identity. So really thinking about how can we have more of these conversations and practice active listening to not just learn to respond or not just learn to say, oh, well, me too, I also struggle with X, Y, or Z, but actually being able to say, how are we listening to what people have to share to be able to gain perspective with transparency and vulnerability? The next one, and we spoke about this a little bit before, but when we're thinking about gaining a sense of belonging, thinking about mentorship, right? So again, whether that's across different demographics, whether that's from individuals who might have been at the company for years versus when they're just joining, whatever that is, or whether it's also external mentorship, right? But really encouraging for individuals to be able to reflect on their own experiences and have someone who can coach them face-to-face, who might be dealing or who might have dealt with similar challenges, right? So being able to have that sense of, okay, well, we're investing in our team's growth as well, and we're really dedicated to having a sense of belonging. The next one is empowerment. So again, having the team feel empowered to share their ideas for larger strategies and what they would actually like to see happen, right? I think that this is something that's so important, where both mentorship and empowerment are powerful tools for folks to really shift the narrative around a previous sense of exclusion and the lack of belonging, and using that to inform change. And the last thing that I'll share is allyship, right? And again, I love allyship because being able to use our power and privilege to be allies is such a powerful tool. But I also do think that it's really important to say, how are we making sure that we're being what I like to call authentic and active allies, right? So not just saying like, I'm an ally and then we don't take, or we don't make change, but we're also saying, how are we constantly lifting up individuals in the company, and then also being able to be champions for them in rooms that they might not necessarily be in, right? So really using that active listening to be able to say, okay, well, learning more about lived experiences, creating space or empowerment for individuals to be able to share that, and then also being an active ally as well. So we are going to go into another breakout room for y'all to really dive into what is something that you found to be successful in engaging your employees to create a stronger sense of belonging. So again, what have you found to be successful in the past for creating a stronger sense of belonging in the team? So I'm going to now pass it over to, thank you so much, Nima, for joining. I'm going to now pass it over to Rob, who's going to put us out in some breakout rooms with different groups for us to dive into this question.
Throw it back to you to take us home.
Awesome. Sienna, I think you will be sharing your screen. Actually, I can share my screen. Give me all just 1 second. I hope you all had productive conversations. I know it's a Friday. We appreciate you all being here and engaging in these important conversations with us all. And I hope you are able to get some insight out of all of them. So before we actually go through the key takeaways, I'd love to hear from some folks. What did you all talk about? And I would love to prioritize, if we haven't heard from someone yet, if you would please like to share.
In my group, I can say we shared a couple stories on some of the initiatives that the companies were taking. I think really my background is the company I'm working with is a young tech startup. So it's the very early stages. We're trying to do the fundamentals correct, which is, look at the job descriptions, look at the interview questions, having more uniform, structured interview questions, and maybe I hope I'm not taking any follow-up suggestions, taking any wind out of your sails, and then doing getting on all the job boards if possible. So PowerToFly is one. So I was sharing that story. Gemma was sharing a story on some of the initiatives that her previous company were doing, organizing a committee or boards to tackle some diverse equity and inclusion challenges as well.
I love that. I love that you mentioned it's not just like you and like certain folks, it's the board. It's like, I love that, because the more folks that we can bring into these conversations, the wider like company-wide impact we can really have. And also the more voices we get involved in it. So I love that. And thank you for naming that, Chris. Is there someone else who'd like to share what you all spoke about?
I wasn't in one of the breakouts, but I was just going to say, one of the things that, Sienna, you reminded me of when you were giving the example of the left hand and right hand, and also thinking about all the different ways that we can be inclusive. I know one of the big things that a lot of companies we talk to are moving to in this hybrid world is, hoteling or hot desking. So people not having a permanent spot. Now that's great, of course, for, this hybrid world, but we actually did a webinar a few weeks ago on neurodiversity, and actually we had 3 speakers who are neurodivergent, who all shared their experiences. And for those people, hot desking, hoteling is a nightmare, so they all do not do well with, being in a different scenario, potentially every day. So I think that's, just a great example of like, well, here's this one great solution that works for a lot of people and what a lot of people are taking up, but we do have to remember, that it is not a one size fits all scenario for pretty much anyone. So whether it's neurodivergency or, another or something else, we do have to always kind of keep those things in mind. And that comes back to surveying and reaching out, and also having anonymous ways that people can, reach out to their, managers and say, hey, this isn't going to work for me.
I love that, Rob. And I think two things of what Rob just said also, it comes back to that piece around flexibility, right? We also can't just create a policy that's like one size fits all, right? We really do need to be offering options to folks and being flexible so that people with different needs are able to sort of move forward in a work style and a workplace environment that works best for them. And the other point I had, I totally forgot. But thank you so much, Rob, for sharing your thoughts. I love sort of hearing that. Is there anyone else that has anything to share?
Yes, I will lean into Zara's thought that she forgot. And just Rob, I really wanted to highlight what he was sharing, because also I think this comes back down to psychological safety, right? Because again, policy, surveys, everything is fantastic, but do we actually have the psychological safety within our teams and within our companies for people to actually feel comfortable enough to, number one, be able to say, hey, I am neurodiverse, identify as neurodiverse, right? Number two, this doesn't work for me. And number three, like being able to communicate that, knowing that it won't go on deaf ears, you know what I mean? And so when thinking about that, really just being able to lean in and say, how are we creating more of that space for the psychological safety,
Yeah, and actually, this is why I'm convinced Sienna like lives in my brain sometimes. What I was gonna speak was about power dynamics, right? And like, they exist everywhere. And so it's great that we have spaces where people can share, but how do we actually make sure that those are safe spaces and that people feel comfortable being able to, and maybe so it's thinking about what are those anonymous spaces that we're creating for people to also share their thoughts. So thank you for that. Thank you for reminding me of my thought. And so with that, I'm going to come back to Sienna, who's going to walk us through a few takeaways from this section.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zara. So let's do this before we wrap up, and we also give y'all a couple of minutes in case you have a meeting after this, etc. But really thinking through, so what are some of the key takeaways of the things that we spoke about in regards to creating a sense of belonging? So number one, not just creating it, but prioritizing it, right? And really thinking about the impact that that's going to have on team members across the board. And so when we think about this, also thinking about how can we mitigate bias and unequal opportunities towards remote employees within a hybrid workforce, right? There is without a doubt going to be more of a sense of connection, belonging when you're able to actually see people in person, et cetera. But thinking about how are we able to bring in those who are remote during our hybrid, oh my goodness, who are remote in our hybrid workforce, to really be able to lean in and say, how are we making sure that we're evening the playing field with events, with retreats, et cetera. And the last one is, again, what we spoke about, finding opportunities to hear lived experiences around a sense of belonging in the workplace and empowering employees to do that. And then again, also creating that psychological safety, right? And maybe that's just also, I'm going to name for us as leaders, us showing up as vulnerable, real human beings allows for our team members to want to do the same, right? So being able to also talk and show up as ourselves in an authentic and vulnerable way also allows for our team members to say, okay, well, I can do it too, and feeling more open to talk about what they need to have a deeper sense of belonging. So Z, I'm going to pass it over to you just for the quick recap and to round us off. And I'll pause there. I was going to be saying thank you so much for your time, et cetera, but I was like, Sarah will do that. So I'm passing it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sienna. So I know I've thoroughly sort of I enjoyed hearing from you all what you were talking about in your breakout rooms, and I do hope that we were able to get some new insights today. So just as a quick reminder about what we actually talked about today, we talked about the Great Resignation, right? We talked about its implications on employment changes. We talked about what employees are currently looking for. What are they asking for within the workplace? We also talked about how to navigate a hybrid workforce, right? And like the different types of responses that companies are sort of using with their employees, but also how are we hearing employee voice? What are those forums that we're creating? And then also ways that companies can really elevate a sense of belonging and understanding within the workplace, right? So we talked about a lot, right? We talked about a lot of different things. And now I want to invite us all to take a moment to reflect and be intentional about how we're going to use what we learned today. So if folks could please either come off mute or just drop it in the chat. But what is one action step that you're committing to based on this conversation that we had today? So please, again, you can come off of mute or you can just drop it in the chat.
This is Melanie. So I realized that as I'm typing, why don't I just come off of mute? That's
I love that.
So one of the things that I would like to be a lot more forward thinking with is getting our managers or upper management to continue to engage in more of the hybrid, that philosophy. It's not that they don't allow people to work remotely and be a little bit more sympathetic to, certain life situations, but just that, understand that you need to hold them more to the performance piece rather than worry about what they're doing every second. We don't clock watch anymore. It's not like that. And sometimes people think that if you're not in the building that you're not performing, and that's not the case. So I'm trying to really redirect that thinking. And a lot of this information has helped me kind of put some things together with that. That's just really, actually, especially with Gemma and her situation, that it's great to see exactly why we do those things. You hate to lose a good employee, but you also have to be respectful of their, like I said, their life situation. So.
Yeah, I love that, Melanie. And again, I love the fact that you shared that you're working on shifting mindsets, right? That doesn't happen overnight, but also recognizing again that the mindset has to shift, right? So I appreciate the intentionality that you're putting behind it and really trying to work with leadership to shift how they're thinking about things. I love that. And I love you naming that here. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. It's a challenge.
It's a challenge, but it's a good one. And we got to push forward. So I love that. And I love that we can support you in that.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I also want to name what Tracy put in the chat. So really taking back the learnings from this meeting, particularly the opportunity to include more people in a hybrid model. I love that. Of course, the more voices we can get involved in the conversation, the better, the more perspectives we have. Also, maybe be clear about the generational divide and the economic divide. Coming into the office every day means daycare, means commuting costs, that for lower wage workers may not be a great trade-off for them. And thank you for naming that, Tracy. There are definitely more costs that are associated with working in person that instead of working remotely. And so being able to name that and really, again, figure out what are your employees looking for and meeting them where they're at. I love that. So thank you for naming that. Other folks, what are you really committing to? What's an action step?
Well, and I had added this in the chat, Zara, but we here, of course, at PowerToFly are a completely remote company, and I realized we don't have really a way to give anonymous feedback. We have done some surveys, so that's not. So there has been some ways, but not just on a day-to-day basis. Like if someone messaged you in Slack, who it is. We have one-on-ones, so it'd be great to come up with ways that people, not just when we do like a big quarterly survey, but just on when something just comes up naturally, how can they reach out with maybe if they choose to not identify themselves? And that's definitely, I don't know what the solution is, but definitely something I'm kind of curious about exploring more.
I love that, Rob. And I love you naming the in real time, right? Instead of waiting for a designated time period to give feedback, how do we give anonymous feedback now? So I love that. Go ahead, Sienna.
Sorry, really quickly, I would just name, Rob, this is something that, number one, I love that you name, and also something that I've been thinking about a lot when we also think about cross-cultural communication and power dynamics, right? And for me, it was something that I was thinking about because also for us, one of our values is around feedback. And because we have the psychological safety, we can talk about it, but what happens if you don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that? Or what happens if in your culture, giving feedback is something you kind of shy away from, or you don't necessarily do that? So thinking also, how are we also supporting the most underrepresented person in the room, and thinking about that of how are we also creating different systems to get towards the same goal. So I love that. And with that, I think Z, were you going to pass it back over to me?
Yep.
Perfect. So let us wrap up, team. And again, I just really want us to continue the conversation. So Melanie was saying, like, this is hard work. I agree, but it's something that it's like baby steps, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so I hope that you all got something. If you got one thing from this conversation today, then that's a success. If someone's going to be watching this afterwards, if you also take one thing from it and try to implement it, that will also be a success. And so something that I just wanted us to really think about is, let's have this be the beginning or the continuation of the conversation, right? So we can't go back and stop employees who have already left from making that decision, but we can say, well, what are we going to do and learn to be able to move forward in the future, and realize that, again, our companies are in such a beautiful middle ground right now where we're really able to create the future and do it in a time where it matters more than ever, because we're at an inflection point and workers and employees really have more power than they have ever in the workplace, and they're using it to really be able to share their voice and their thoughts, and also holding leadership and companies accountable. So I think it's really important for us to really be able to say, okay, well, how are we choosing to invest our time, our money, our energy, our brain power, right? All of the different things into creating inclusive workplaces that truly support our employees. And so we just want to say thank you so much for your time today, for coming. This is not the end of the conversation. We're going to be hosting different events like this. And Rob, I want to pass it over to you so that you can round us out, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, just thank you again, everyone. We're going to send out an edited recording today so people can revisit that. We'll also send some of those other assets that Sienna talked about. We also have 2 great reports on these issues that we can also share the links for those as well, so you can review those and share those with your teams. But thank you again. Have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.